A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, there's disturbing news that has come out about the nation of Iran. More than 900 Iranian civilians were executed last calendar year in 2024. Countless more received death sentences for religiously based charges. 96 Iranian Christians were sentenced to a combined 263 years in jail. Well, let's get a focus on what's happening in Iran and the go-to organisation that is so often across the details, Open Doors, around the persecuted church and those Christians that are really doing it tough. Nathan Holland is joining us. He's Relationships Manager for Open Doors in Victoria. Nathan, thanks for joining us today on 2020.
Thank you for having us, Neil. We really appreciate you highlighting these stories of our brothers and sisters.
Iran's in the news for lots of reasons, and for us to be talking about persecuted Christians there, give us a reminder where Iran sits on the Open Doors World Watch List. That's the 50 most significant persecutors of Christians around the world. Where do they sit?
Yeah, so the World Watch List, Open Doors update that yearly to be able to give the most up-to-date information to believers on the most persecuted places. And currently, Iran sits at number 9 out of the 50 most persecuted places around the world for Christians today. So, very characteristic of the top 10 in the World Watch List is how persecution is driven not just by the government or the regime, but also by one's community life and their family life. And so we see those nuances definitely playing out in the country of Iran at the moment, particularly with steps that the Iranian government seems to have intensified its efforts to isolate and financially undermine the Christian community as what we see as a part of a broader strategy to suppress the church growth and church influence within the nation of Iran.
You know, over recent times, Nathan, we've been monitoring those developments like a collapse of Islam throughout Iran as a nation. Something like 50,000 mosques closed because people are not turning up there to worship. That's very significant. Is there something that's connected to that, do you think, along the parallel of Christians now getting an intensified persecution from Iranian authorities?
So one thing we notice with the nation of Iran is that there's no separation between one's national identity and one's religious identity. And so we have seen 50,000 mosques close in Iran. And that's significant. That's 2/3 of the mosques that were in Iran are now closed. But we're seeing that as not just a religious revolution, but also a rejection of the political standpoint of the regime of Iran.
Okay, religious revolution and, where the political regime stands. All of this, it's all very good to talk about, but are there personal stories that people are forwarding to you in your role here in Australia as you're given responsibility for monitoring the circumstances in Iran? Are there some stories you've got that just humanise what we're talking about today?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many stories that come in from Iran, and if people want to see more, they can go to the Open Doors website and read through the dossier. But particularly recently, we've highlighted stories like that of Nargis Nazri, a pregnant woman who has just recently been sentenced to 16 years in prison. And the reason she's been put in prison is for, and we quote, propaganda activities contrary to Islamic law, just because she was involved in a house church and supporting a women's freedom movement. And this is also similar to the story of Abbas Suri, a 48-year-old who received 15 years on similar charges. And one thing that we have noted is that in this wave of arrests that have happened in Iran, we've also noted that there have been such high bail amounts put on these believers. In our economic terms, it's around 8,000 to 40,000 to release for believers to be released. And so we've also seen that this has been a strategic move to also try to take wealth away from believers and put it into the hands of government officials.
Nathan, the authorities in Iran have so often been enthusiastic to issue death sentences for people who are Christian, because it sort of undermines Islamic faith if you're going to be public with your Christian faith. The thought of a death sentence, not everyone gets executed, although it does appear that the number of executions is on the rise. Is there something in there? Can you reflect on that?
What we can reflect on is that the number of executions in Iran is on the rise, and the convictions of those executions are range from, and we quote, like corruption on earth or waging war on God. So it's very clear that these executions are religiously motivated to believers, to Christians. And because I think it's important to note that Iran really does see Christianity as a Western force that seeks to politically undermine it. And so Christians there bear the risk of being seen as a national threat. And so we really do need to be lifting up our brothers and sisters there in prayer as they are facing not just. And I think sometimes when we hear about executions, we can just think of that tragic moment, which is horrible and needs to be highlighted. But I think it's also worth noting that when an execution happens, that's a father, that's a mother, that's a sister and a brother lost within a community. And the ongoing psychological and emotional effects that can have on families and the church is significant. So not just praying for those executions to stop, but also for the healing of communities that have experienced those executions.
And Christians focus here, and their crime against Islam. You mentioned with Nargis Nasri the thought of being involved in a house church or just making a social media post that's contrary to the Islamic regime or supporting a women's freedom movement. Those sorts of things, they don't sound criminal to us here, but under an Islamic regime, they're pretty severe as criminal activities. When you're supporting those sorts of churches on the ground in Iran, how does that work? Are churches still allowed to function?
So I think that's a very good point, that when we think of illegal activities, like, we might think of smuggling drugs or real antisocial behavior. And I think it's quite a surprise for people to know that Christianity and practicing Christianity is seen as an illegal activity within these countries. And so for believers here in Australia to understand that simply gathering together in your home around the Word of God and worshiping Jesus is an illegal activity in Iran. And so we need to be highlighting that is the reality being faced by local believers in Iran.
Is it the case, Nathan, that in Iran, with such harsh penalties for being a Christian and being subversive to the Islamic State, that when there's a death sentence that's issued, sometimes there's a pardon that comes along with that? Is there anything political in that, do you think?
I'm not too sure to see if there's any, political in that. But like one good news story to share, though, is that we have seen multiple instances where there have been reduced sentences or releases from prison following a pardon. And so I think it's really important to still be highlighting some of these good news stories. Like even recently in December of 2024, we saw an Iranian convert, Pastor Matthias, release after serving nearly 3 years of his 6-year prison sentence. And so as for the motivation behind that release, we're not certain, but it should be noted noted, though, that the good news stories we're seeing in Iran don't change the grave injustice that's occurring to these Christians. And while these believers were pardoned, they weren't acquitted, and the laws used against them have not changed. And so even though we do see moments of pardons and death sentences not being followed through, there still hasn't been any change to the laws that were used to justify these convictions.
Well, Iran is in the thinking of Christian believers, and Nathan Holland, to bring attention to Christians who are under severe persecution in Iran. No doubt there'll be some listeners that want to read some more stories, to connect a little more closely with what's going on with Open Doors, to get behind some of the programs that you've got there as you partner with churches on the ground to keep them strong and flourishing. Let me just point listeners to the website opendoors.org.au, and you want people to pray for believers in Iran, and no doubt there'll be some campaigns and things like that people can support. How do you want people listening to us right now to respond?
I think the first way we'd love believers to respond is to remember the call in Hebrews 13, to remember those who are in prison as if you were suffering with them. And so with this wave of incarceration that we're seeing in Iran, with 96 Iranian Christians being sentenced to a combined 263 years in jail, just in the past year alone, we want to remind the church in Australia to pray for these brothers and sisters as if you were suffering with them. That's what it says in Hebrews chapter 13. And if people would like to come alongside the work of Open Doors, which is simply to serve the persecuted and to strengthen the church, they can get in touch or do a donation through our website, opendoors.org.au.
Nathan Holland, Relationship Manager for Open Doors in Victoria. Nathan, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Thank you for having us, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.